This is a good one, people.
This is a good one because we just had a lot of experience with this.
So this video kind of stemmed out. Please go check out our last video where we go to the Smoky Mountains and we deal with like some pretty insane weather. And there were a lot of gear fails and some potentially dangerous ones. So today we're going to talk about what to do when your gear fails.
Bum, bum, bum.
Also, remember to subscribe. Helps out the channel. Click that subscribe button.
Yeah, and everybody complains that they don't get, we never know when you're going to live stream.
I know.
Well,
click
hit
the
damn
bell. Hit the bell. All right. We live stream a lot and we don't always tell you when we're live streaming, but hit the bell, hit subscribe. We're also in beautiful 4K. So if you're watching on a device that allows 4K, please watch it in 4K. It is better. I do want to talk, before we actually get into this, I want to talk about, because I think it's important to talk to, because this is something I think a lot about, is what is the most likely piece of gear to fail and what's going to be the biggest deal if this piece of gear, like a trip ender.
Right.
So first, I think in terms of trip ending pieces of gear, and you kind of had one, any serious damage to your shelter
Or your insulation.
and then kind of by proxy, anything that you sleep with, anything you need to sleep. So I'm thinking of like in a tent, a sleeping pad.
Yeah.
So I'm always super, super anal about sleeping pads popping. I've never had one pop. I baby the crap out of my sleeping bags. I bring, no joke, I have 3 different types of patch kits I bring. So I bring a patch kit for a Thermarest, a patch kit for the Nemo, and I bring the Tenacious Tape patch kit that Lightsmith sells. I have never had a sleeping pad pop. In the winter, it'd have to be a trip ender, right? Because you're not going to get any insulation. You'll get a little bit from the material.
Yeah.
But
nah, you're done.
I think a sleeping pad popping is a trip ender for sleeping on the ground.
Go get some spruce boughs.
In the winter, I think it's a trip ender.
Yeah. I'm not hardcore enough to sleep through that.
So if you're in a hammock camper, I think a trip ender is any sort of breakage in your suspension or your hammock. Although you had a hammock break and you made it work.
Yep.
You want to talk about it?
Well, I mean, one of the spreader bars in my Dutch War Banyan busted in half. My head-end spreader bar.
I thought that was going to be a trip ender because I didn't know if your underquilt would stay on there without those spreader bars.
And it was a little loose.
But you made it work.
Yeah, it worked.
Now, in terms of what gear is most likely to break, what do you think? Like, what do you think breaks the most for us?
Well, I think in general, it seems to be sleeping pad issues.
Yeah, we've never had one though.
I've had way back in the day. My Neo Air had issues.
Did that end your trip?
No, but there was a few times where I'd have to reinflate it like 3 or 4 times throughout the night, and then I had to patch it. So
okay, yeah, that just sounds like a terrible situation.
Yeah, it sucked. From what I've seen other people talk about and other people's videos, it seems to be sleeping pad related, to be honest.
I think now what spurred this and what happened on our last trip, and I'm going to call this a fail, even though it kind of isn't, but down stuff getting wet.
Yeah, that's really dangerous.
That is a gear fail only in that the down is not going to insulate you or keep you warm when it gets wet. That's what we had on our last trip. Now, if you watch it, we all had Dyneema packs. All of us, I think other than Bryce, maybe you didn't, had wetness on the inside of our packs. The inside of your pack wasn't wet?
No, it was bone dry.
Mine was. And we hiked in the rain for 4 or 5 hours, constant downpour. We got to camp. Dan had standing water in his pack and all of his down was wet, like wringing out down wet. The temps were low 30s and wet down. There's nothing you can do, right?
No, not in that. In that situation, all you can really do is that if you had some like dry insulation, you could try to like layer up as much as possible and like get through the night. But
so my sleeping bag, which is down, did get wet. It was just damp. It wasn't like wring out wet. But more importantly, my clothes were in a Dyneema dry bag and they were all dry. So I was like, even if my sleeping bag's a little wet, as long as my clothes are dry and the inside of my sleeping bag is dry, I think I'll generate enough heat over the course of the night to dry it out. And that was fine. My sleeping pad was wet, but that wasn't a big deal. I put the wet side down and I inflated it and it was fine. But down getting wet, I don't know if it's technically a fail. I mean, it's a failure if you let your down get wet. Might not be your fault, but it's a failure in some capacity. I think that's probably, other than a sleeping pad popping, the most common gear that could fail.
Yeah, your
is
stuff.
Down stuff getting wet, or insulation getting wet.
I mean, there's some pretty cool technology now with down where they've got like some high-end down can still retain some heat or some insulation when it's a little wet. So, but I like, how many times do we have to preach like pack liners in certain types of stuff?
Yeah.
I think it's like a really romantic idea with these Dyneema packs that you can just throw everything in there and save like a quarter of an ounce and just be fine.
No.
Like, sure, most of the year you could probably get away with that, but like especially going in the winter, and especially knowing that it was going to rain.
You gotta step it up. And that was a mistake. I needed to do that as well. Another piece of gear that I meant to talk about this at the beginning, that is an absolute, for the most part, a trip ender. It's never happened to us. A water filter going down.
Yeah.
Depends on your fuel situation and where you're hiking.
And how long your hike is, because you have oil.
And how much you're willing to throw the dice. If you don't have a way to treat water, you might be okay. If you have a stove, you can go to boiling it, but that's going to use a lot of stove fuel.
Yeah, and I'm not going to like sit there and build my own, like get some clay and get some ash.
Now, you could also use a fire.
Yeah.
But depending on your situation, like for instance, two things that you can do to help with this. One is, if you're using a Sawyer, I always carry an extra O-ring for the Sawyer from my old Sawyer, because I've known people where the O-ring goes bad on a trip, it won't work.
I think the new ones come with a spare one now.
Yeah, and then also I mean to carry this, and I did years ago, I know you did, is a chemical treatment backup.
Yeah, I don't have any now, but I did. We probably should, between the two of us, carry like a few tablets just in case.
Yeah, and I used to carry some iodine tablets. I think we should carry some Aquamir. Now, we each carry a filter, and we're always backpacking with each other, so I think that's okay. But that's another thing that if that piece of gear goes, it's gonna suck. Now, let's talk about what to do when your gear fails.
Yeah, and actually, we should list off all the gear that failed on our last trip. So, hammock, down got wet. We had a stove go out. Our tried and true rain gloves were just absolute garbage.
Yeah.
And
the outdoor research rain gloves
instantly
with the Pertex
soaked through.
And that's not the first time that's happened.
Man, that's crap. What else failed?
Other than your tent, no shelters failed.
Well, I mean, one of the shelters was a pain in the butt to get up.
Yeah, that's not a fail. Dan was trying this really nice, pretty intricate Hyperlight mountain gear tent that didn't work. I mean, it works just in the rain, pouring down rain. It's dark. It's not something you want to be dealing with.
Yeah, so maybe it's just like just wet stuff in general, making lives difficult.
So the first thing you can do if your gear fails, we kind of talked on it, is, and this requires some planning, is have redundancy.
Yeah.
Have patch kits for a sleeping pad. Have a backup to your water filter. Carry some extra. This is something he did that I didn't. Carry some extra big trash bags with you in case your pack wets out on day one and you know your stuff is still dry, but you might be going more days. Like, I used a backup trash bag from you.
Yeah, and the funny thing is I had that trash bag in my pack just so I could pick up litter along the way.
So the first thing you should do is have some sort of redundancy systems in place, like we talked about. Ways to repair gear, ways to replace a water filter. That's the biggest thing you can do. Now, that's not going to help you if you didn't think about doing that and you're out there and your gear fails. Yep. So if your stuff, so seriously, if your down stuff wets out and it's below freezing, there's nothing you can do about that.
I think you
can build a fire.
Yeah. I think you've got to understand, like, what are the risk factors, and then you have to be smart enough to know when to tap it.
Yeah, that's another thing. And Dan struggled with that too on the first night. He really struggled with tapping out. Because if you've never had to tap out before, Andy and I have tapped out
Oh,
before.
we've tapped out plenty of times.
Yeah, I mean, our mantra is there's no point in being out there if you're just going to be miserable. And there's certainly no point in being out there if you're going to be miserable and put yourself in a dangerous situation. There's no point. Why? Just go sleep in the car or, you know, I mean, there's no reason to do that. So first, get over the point, get over yourself. I mean, if you got to tap, you got to tap. It's not a big deal. Another thing, Andy preaches this a lot, and we talk about this, is if your gear fails, first, just don't freak out and just take it one step at a time.
Yep. So just to give you some examples, like we arrive at camp, we're really cold. All of us are really cold because you've been hiking in the rain for 5 hours. You're sweating, and then you get to camp, and you're no longer generating as much body heat, and then the cold starts setting in, and
you start to panic a little bit.
Yeah, and you've got to be very, very careful while you're setting up camp to ensure that you're not getting everything wet, and that takes time. So you can't just like immediately get into your down, get into your puffy, and set up camp, because that's just going to get wet. So you've got to set up your camp while you're soaking wet. And then and at the same time being mindful not to get anything else wet. And that's very challenging to do in cold weather. And
you're going to start to, another thing in cold weather is
dexterity.
Your dexterity is going to start to go. So first off, like we were doing things that required the most dexterity, like setting up a tent. Do that first, because even if your gloves are wet, your hands are still going to get cold even if they're gloved up. So that was another thing I was like, oh yeah, you got to do all the dexterous stuff first. But first, when your gear fails, identify if it's a trip ender or not. That should be easy. That shouldn't take a lot of time. Okay, the worst thing you can do is sit there for an hour and debating, what do I do? I mean, is this where no, it's going to be really obvious. Are you not going to be able to be warm all night? Are you going to be wet and cold all night? All right, get out of there.
Yep.
If it's a sleeping pad, okay, determine if you can fix it or not. If it's a huge rip down the side, you're out of there.
Yep.
So first, just decide, is your trip over or not? And that should be a quick decision. If it's not over, then you need to prioritize warmth first above anything else, and then do stuff that requires the finest dexterity. Do the hardest stuff first, because your mental state and your physical state is going to be deteriorating the longer it goes before you get cozy and warm and comfortable.
I like to think of it as just like create steps in your head. Like for me, setting up the hammock was, okay, I got to get my tarp up. Once I get my tarp up, then I can get my hammock up underneath my tarp. And then once I get my hammock up, then I can start unpacking my dry bags into my hammock and get my quilts out. And then I can get my underquilt on, get my top quilt out. And then once I do that, now here's what's funny is then I've got to figure out what I'm going to do with my food, because we're not eating. So I'm not going to get into I can't get into my warm stuff yet because I got to go back out in the rain and hang so that's when we were like slamming snacks.
Yeah.
And then once all that's over, I know in my head, okay, now I'm going to go underneath my tarp. I'm going to get out of my wet clothes, get into my stuff, and get into the hammock and get warm.
Yeah, my entire thought process was, I was drenched, freezing cold, but like I have dry clothes to get into. So just get everything up, then get in that tent and get out of your wet clothes as soon as possible, like immediately. So I just focused on that, and we got through it. But honestly, we wanted to make this video because there's not enough talk about this kind of stuff, failing at things, what can we learn? What can we do better? What can we change? So next time we don't have to worry about this. So we just want to talk about that in this video, quick little video.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that I did when we talked about redundancy is the reason I do this is because I've learned is that I have way too many socks. I had 3 pairs of gloves and I had 2 hats because I knew stuff was going to get wet.
And that's a good, that just goes into be redundant.
Yeah.
So that's what we do when our gear fails. Now check out, we did a live stream debrief of this trip with Dan and Bryce right after we went. Check that out. I'll throw a link up right there. We talk more about this stuff, but we just want to talk through, what's going to be the most likely thing to fail, what's going to end your trip if it fails, and what to do when gear fails. So there you go. Yep. Stay safe out there, people.
Yeah, don't die.
Don't die. We'll see everybody in the next one.